And we are live. Welcome everyone to the techexcellence meetup. My name is Daniel Moka, and today I will be the co-host of this session together with Valentina. Let's get started with the introduction. We are techexcellence. Our vision is to raise the bar of technical excellence across the world. Let me introduce you our organizers. First and foremost, the one and only Valentina. She's the founder of techexcellence and also organizers of these events. Next to her, we have Oliver Zihler, who is also co-organizer and co-host of these events. And last but not least, Daniel Moka, me, who is also helping these two amazing people to host these events. Our speakers in the past, we already had really great informative sessions. All the recordings are available on YouTube. I highly recommend to check them out. One can learn a lot from those. So here are our speakers from the past. And of course, for the future, we have great plans, and we are planning to grab in great speakers as well. And you can follow us on social media, for example, Meetup, YouTube, of course. So we are available on LinkedIn, Twitter, and GitHub. Huge thanks to our sponsors, Optivem, and to our partners, QE Unit. So tech excellence, learn how to deliver quality software faster. So let me introduce you the two speakers today. We have today two awesome speakers from Switzerland, Oliver Zihler and Alina Liburkina. They are both a big fan of domain-driven design and extreme programming. They are big experts in these areas, which leads to the topic of today, namely exploring your business domain with eventstorming and clean architecture. Before I hand over the microphone, I would like to mention that please, if you have some questions during the sessions, then feel free to ask it in the chat section in YouTube. And I will guarantee you that at the end of the time, we will dedicate some time for that, and we will do our best to have those questions answered. So Alina, Oliver, the stage is yours. I wish you good luck, and yeah, looking forward.
And a lot of fun. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for this introduction. So let me find our slides. So it's actually pretty cool to be for once on this side of the event and not on the hosting side, because now I really feel also the nervousness and how it, how you feel like you forget everything. But as Daniel already mentioned, we are very much interested in domain-driven design, clean architecture, clean code, refactoring, all the things. And actually, I think you can never stop learning these things. You're always an avid learner, and you are never really finished. And it's like this Dunning-Kruger effect. When you start to think you know everything, then all of a sudden it goes down again, and you think you know nothing at all. So this session here is actually going to be a little bit more high level, a little bit, we have lots of topics we cover. I mean, how to actually explore a business domain, and then also how to map this to something like clean architecture. Of course, all great tools for doing domain-driven design, but only some of the tools. So we will look at those, probably not in the depth that everybody would expect, but if you have questions, well, we can discuss them afterwards. So let's get started. And before we actually go into the details, we want to think a little bit about why do we have so many concepts like domain-driven design or user stories or use case acceptance test, even object-oriented programming or agile development? Well, all these things somehow have nothing to do with the programming language, or let's say with the computer that executes the program that we write. So what is actually the problem? So why do we need to solve this?
One of the very known problems is that business and devs speak different languages. When I say we speak different languages, I don't mean languages like German or French. I mean terms, like the understanding of terms. It it might mean that devs and business don't have common vocabulary. Could you slide, please?
Didn't I?
No.
Oh, now I went back. Now
Okay, now it works.
Good.
Sorry, guys. What does it mean? It could lead for us to a person in the middle. This person in the middle could be a B or PO in our case. And if we have a person in the middle, but the meaning of terms could get lost in translations. Like every side could understand something else with the same terms. And this is quite difficult. So if we have a translator like this, it could happen that devs and business would even never meet. And if they never meet, they could not share the same vision. And if they don't share the same vision, devs don't stand behind the idea of business. So they implement something, business gets wrongly implemented requirements. And if they get it, they start to fear that the project could fail. They start to control devs. And we devs know what happened if they get controlled. We might get quite angry. And this is more or less a big picture of this. If devs get angry and business don't trust devs, they don't have the same knowledge, they don't share the same terms. So the whole project might fail because it's overall distrust and dissatisfaction, and it's quite a huge risk for failures.
So basically, everybody speaks a different language, nobody trusts each other, and we also see this in the code. So when we have no business or domain focus, it typically also means that the developers have a quite different mental model of how the software works, and this probably does not represent the way that the software works, that the business processes work actually. So the mental model between the business representatives and the developer may be quite different. And when they require, for example, a change, it may be very hard to actually find the place in the code that needs to be adopted. But this may be only on the business domain focused because we actually get the money from the business. So when we talk about domain-driven design, it's basically always business domain-driven design. But it's not only the business. We also have stuff like, for example, the UX. When people talk to the UX people and the developers that talk to each other, just imagine you have one big HTML, no small components. How do you actually find anything that might exist in the real world in this code? So it's very hard to find anything. So productivity is quite low there. And the same goes for something like, for example, surrounding systems and any databases. When you talk to these people that are more focused on a different system, for example, and you don't find an abstraction in your code, well, then your productivity suffers as well. And overall, the mental model from all these different groups are actually quite, well, they vary. And this means that overall the distrust can actually also be seen in the code. So code usually where the business domain or the domain in general is not very well represented also is an indication that the people probably don't talk to each other that much. And actually for me, that was always like the essence of domain-driven design is that we shift our focus to the domain because that's like the real world. This is we can represent the real world in the code, and the code that actually gets produced is just a documentation or a product, like an artifact of the discussions that we have between all these different kinds of stakeholders. Because if we don't talk to each other, this is what can happen. In the end, the productivity gets so low that the business needs to close, and then nobody has any job anymore. This is what I said before. When we have this domain-driven design and focus more on the people and what they're actually working with, this is what we want. We want a shared mental model. So this is what we display here too, that everybody actually, when they talk about concepts from the business domain, for example, you can find that in the code. Or from the UX, you can also find that in the code. Everything has some kind of abstraction within the code, and it is easy to talk to each other because we all share the same knowledge or the same idea of how our business should work. But the problem is, how do we get actually to a shared mental model? I mean, usually we don't talk to each other, or that's how it appears at least. And initially we wanted to show something like talking to each other as a domain expert and a programmer, similar to how Eric Evans in his blue book described how he talked to a domain expert. And then we were like, well, that's a little bit boring. Maybe there's something else we could do. And then we came across this thing called eventstorming. And there are probably lots of people that already know how eventstorming work and they have applied it. And we probably wouldn't consider ourselves the experts on event storming because we have done it, but we haven't done it to an extent probably other people have. But we still think it's a really cool method to apply to actually get to know the domain of a new system, of an existing system. And instead of making a long, boring PowerPoint presentation, we just thought we could actually play it through a business, a fictional business, where we play different roles. So usually for an event storming workshop, you would actually invite all the stakeholders, all the business people, developers, anybody who can contribute to getting to know the domain. We are only two, so we do it together. I'm going to be something of a developer and a facilitator, while Alina is going to be also a bit of a developer, but she has an idea for a new app that she wants to develop. So we will take on our hats. As you can see, I'm a dev and also facilitator, and we have the biz and the dev. So we will basically take over the roles of several people that usually would be in such an event. And we will introduce concepts on the go while we explore this fictional domain. So let me switch to the other screen. So usually event storming is something you do in a big room with lots of whiteboard or white space, at least, like a big roll, you will put it on the wall, and so that the whole all the processes can actually be visualized and everybody can stand and talk. Sometimes you cannot do that. I mean, like for example here, or when you are in a remote setting, it might be actually quite hard to have one room and one whiteboard. So instead, you can use something like Miro. We actually did I tried that out a lot, and Miro has some advantages, some disadvantages, but we just use it here. So let's get started. We will now switch to our roles. So, hi, Alina. How are you? So you told me about this cool new application you wanted to implement. Can
Yes,
you
I
tell me
guess.
a bit about it?
Yeah, I guess I need to reintroduce me. I am today not in the role of developer or not 100% in the role of developer. I'm actually, with my second job, I'm a semi-professional dancer and event organizer. And because of this, I really, to make my life a bit easier, I don't want to make the whole organization with paper or like old school. I want to have a proper application for creation of events. I hope you can help me with it.
Yes, we will do something a little bit different than if we just talk to each other. So as a first thing, we will just think about what kind of domain events or what kind of events should happen in your system. So you mentioned you want to be able to create dancing events. So,
yeah, this is the most important one.
So we will use these sticky notes here, these orange sticky notes to represent such domains. So you said you want to create dancing events. So we would represent these in past tense. So every domain event is something that happened in the past. So for example, this would be dancing events created.
Or
This
at
would
least
be the
one
first thing.
event.
Exactly, it's one event for once.
Mm-hmm.
So what other events can you think of that happen in this system?
Another important thing for me would be that I could promote my events.
So you want that means at some point your dancing events will be promoted.
Yes. And important thing is also I don't want just to promote them like on our website. I want to promote them on different ways, websites like free websites and paid websites, and I would like to be able to differentiate between them.
Okay, so maybe we can say when you publish it, you want it to first publish it on your own website. So let's say we call this dancing event published. And
Yes, it's also a form of promotion, I guess, publishing our own website.
Okay. And you said there would be some external websites that would also promote and display those dancing events for other people to see.
Yes, and with this differentiation like free and paid.
Okay, so we can add another thing with these pink sticky notes here. We can just call these are external systems. And you mentioned two of those. So we are going to have something like unpaid websites, and the other one would be a paid website.
Right. I think we don't need to list now which websites, but I can think of some.
Yeah, okay. We can keep that for another session. Now we just want to like model the initial flow of creating and publishing such the dancing event, right?
Right.
Okay, what else? So actually, these dancing events would be promoted by the websites probably. So we will put them over here. This is actually something, I mean, as you can see here, I already put them like a little bit in order. I mean, sometimes you could actually start with just an exploration session where you just post all the events and they have no order. But actually, as we don't have that much time yet, we can actually put a timeline over here and order them in according to the time when these events are actually happening in the system.
Makes sense.
So now you said we have it created and then published. I simply wonder. You said something like we want to really focus on dancing events, and you don't want anything else to be published on this website, right?
Yes, I don't want another platform like let's say Meetup. I want a really specific platform for dancing events. And this important thing for me would be I don't want like to be again a free platform for huge companies to promote their events. I want people like me who just like organizing but don't have a big company behind, just have a platform for it to promote their events.
Okay, so you want the dancing event, the creation of dancing events probably to be limited somehow.
Yeah, I could think of maybe five unpublished events.
Okay, so we make a little sticky note here with this, what's that color, reddish color, and say like no more than 5. That's around what you would say. That's around a good number for dancing events. I mean, this can change. I mean, we don't know yet, but just as an initial thing. Okay, and how do you know already how to make sure that we have a dancing event and not some generic event or even something maybe illegal?
Yeah, I could think of like later, not an MVP version, but way later, maybe to have an algorithm which could help me with it. But I think in the first step, someone has to manually validate them. Like we have to check the text or images.
Okay, so we have another event basically validated, or let's say your dancing event is not only validated, and it is validated. Just I mean, there are probably two possibilities. So if your dancing event is valid, then it is validated. And on the other hand, if your dancing event is invalid, then how do you call it? Dancing event
Rejected, for example.
rejected. That would be something good, yes. Dancing event or validation rejected. Okay, so, and you said this could be a manual case, so we will probably, let's not look at in this session how we are going to model it. I will treat it as an external system, something like validator. We don't know yet how that works, so you say maybe we will have a manual validation.
Or maybe we even might outsource the whole validation part.
Yeah. So just to make sure these red things we can use for also for such pain points. So for example, if we have a manual validation that would probably be a pain point, we want to automate that. Or you said we could outsource it to a different company. We don't know that yet. Okay. So if we go over here, if we have the dancing event published, I mean, for you, the promotion of this dancing event probably is very important, right? So I guess you would inform people or some subscribers that a new dancing event was published, right?
Yeah, it's a good idea. Maybe subscribers could have some tags, and then they would be notified if someone was using those tags.
Okay, so I will just put this over here and call it notified about new dancing event, right? Okay, so now I actually forgot. I will put here also a definition of this one. So this could be a pain point, or sometimes also a general note. We can just put it with that. So now that we have actually lots of events, can you think of, have you forgotten something? Well, we don't know yet. The next thing we want.
I can think of one actually.
Yeah.
If the event is rejected, what do? We need a possibility to update or edit the event.
That's true. So when it is rejected, at some point it should be dancing event updated again. So this needs to be done before it can actually be published. So it goes back and has to be revalidated again.
Exactly.
And then, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so now we can actually think of what triggers these events. And to show these, we will use such blue sticky notes. We can use we can call these commands. And we will add these commands to basically all the events before the events. So dancing event created. So we need a command like, for example, create dancing event. And here we can already think about who is going to create the dancing event. So I guess this is going to be some person, some event organizer that you mentioned before, right?
Yeah.
So this is what I call an actor. And an actor is denoted with such a yellow sticky note. So let's put it here and call it event organizer. Maybe we have other things that need to be done by the event organizer. For example, the dancing event needs to be updated. So we probably can actually use this here too. So this would be update dancing event. And how about the other things? Do you see, I mean, we will have to publish a dancing event after it is validated. We need to publish the dancing event.
Actually, I could imagine another flow. Like I would create an event, and when I'm ready, I would click on publish, and then it would be validated.
Okay, so we actually would put that over here. And also the event organizer, right, would try to publish it because they would know best how to actually or when to publish it. So from here, it would probably go into the system that we don't specify here.
Mm-hmm.
And when it is validated, we will be informed again about this.
Yeah, and if it's valid, I think it would be better if it's published automatically.
Okay, so basically this is another thing we can do now here. Anything that is not triggered by a person is basically triggered by the system. So whenever something happens, then something else happens. And we can denote this with such a, well, lilac, I think. This is called lilac, yes. A lilac sticky note, we can call this a policy. This is an automation policy. So whenever the event is validated, we will actually execute this policy. Of course, we need a command in between here. So this is also publish dancing event on our external or on our website.
Right.
And then it is published.
Mm-hmm.
Probably once it is published, we will send it to, we will promote it or hope to promote it on these external websites, right?
Exactly. First, we see the dancing event on our website, and in the same time, or maybe a bit later, it should trigger automatically publishing on different websites, like both free and paid. Okay,
so we have some policy again, and this is now the cool thing about Miro compared to a real board. You can just grab everything and move it around. So we have a policy that goes here from the dancing event published, and this will then promote on external websites. Let's simplify it like that, which will then send the data to the external system. Okay, And we also have this notification over here. So we probably need to notify.
Yes, also automatically.
Notify subscribers about new event. And this is also using some automation policy here. And then they're notified. And these paid websites, what should actually happen if, I mean, they can promote it, but probably for some reason they may decline it, right?
They might decline it, and I think it would be great if the event organizer would get notified so that he could edit the event again, but he also needs a reason of rejection.
Okay, so we also need to add some reason here for why they got rejected.
Exactly, because the organizer needs to know what he or she could change, right?
I will just write that over here.
Mm-hmm.
So, and both basically can trigger these events.
Yeah.
Let's draw it a little bit like that. Okay. Did I? No, that one needs to go here.
Now it looks better.
Like that. So, something like that. Okay. And then we said we need to update it. So again, we have this over here where we have the validation. So if the validation basically fails, this is also coming from this validator, then we need to be able to update it again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But actually, it's not important if it's our validator or validator of patent-free websites. It's also should be, or I as an organizer should be able to update my event.
So you mean if it comes from here?
Yes.
Okay. So basically these two trigger the same command. Okay. So the last thing to think about before, or next thing to think about is actually what kind of data these people need to be able to update it. And you actually mentioned it, and I put it on this red one, but probably this is more of a so-called read model. So we have this green sticky here, and a read model is basically anything a user of a system needs to have to make a decision. So this is a read model. So this can be any text or document or GUI that has some information that we can use to make a decision. And if we look over here, let's make a little bit of space over here because we have the creation. So what does a user need to create such a dancing event?
I think the information of what is, let's call it legal on our website.
Yeah.
Plus maybe like the starting button, a plus or something.
Yeah, some kind of plus button. And we already said that the update needs a reason for rejections or some kind of comment. And here to publish, we probably need to know what happens afterwards, right?
Yeah, maybe the information, how long it might take.
Yeah.
For the whole validation. Or even with validation will happen because we never mentioned this one.
Yeah. So how long validation takes, and because of the size, I make just another one. Validation can be rejected. Some information about that, right?
Yes.
And what they need to do then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if I zoom out a bit, we have now all the ones that need to read something. The rest is represented by policies. So now we can actually think what kind of data we need to execute these commands. So if we look here, on what kind of data will this create dancing event be executed?
It's quite far for me to read. Maybe you could zoom in a bit.
Yep, one moment. It's this, like that.
Mm-hmm. Way better.
So create dancing event. We probably, I mean, we cannot have more than 5. So are these are only the unpublished events, right? So if you already have one published, I mean, do you sum it up, or is it?
No, it doesn't count. Only unpublished events, because as I said, I don't want big companies to stand behind.
Okay, so we can represent these kind of things with something called an aggregate, or let's just call it some data for now, data and some state. So we can put it here, and let's say this is an unpublished, these are the unpublished dancing events.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put them here and put them to the background, right? Okay, so here we have a surrounding system in between. And if we go here, we actually have, we want to update one dancing event. So we probably
here we don't need all events, I guess. Here we need a specific event.
Okay, so this is one dancing event.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And over here, if we want to publish it, we publish a dancing event on our website. Well, we probably need the same data to do that.
I guess so.
We also need, I mean, dancing event probably is going to have something like title and description, images, and if we want to publish it, then we need all that. So let's put the same thing in between. I will just copy it so that we don't mess up all the flow. Okay. And here we notify the subscribers about the new event. So here we need to know who is actually our subscribers, I assume.
Sounds correct for now.
For now, yeah. Can always change, of course. Okay. So this looks more or less complete for now. Okay, so as a last step, let's just remove the timeline and let's think about which concepts belong together. Which concepts belong into a same, let's call it a context. So on the
creation, I would say.
So we have this creation part, right?
Yeah, so because this creation is something different to the rest.
So we can actually surround that. Ooh, that's large. And let's call this creation. too small. Okay, maybe move that a bit up. That's already up, so I will move it here. Okay. Adopt this. Yeah, like that. Okay, so this one would be our creation context. What else do we have? So here we have basically the publication, and then we always have the same data. So we have here the dancing event. You publish dancing event on the website, and we have here the updating of the dancing event. So these two things probably are the same. So maybe we could think about having these things in an own context without the external system, right?
Let's try it.
Let's see how that feels like. And I would call this something like the publication.
I think for me it makes sense because in order to publish something, you need to update this probably a couple of times, talking from experience.
So let me move that one a bit out. Exactly, and basically these events that happen by the external system, they will come back to us into this context. So this is now a little bit ugly, but they will actually make this update happen again. And then we also have the subscribers up here, and we could think, that's not good. We could think that these subscribers somehow belong into an own context, right?
Because I actually even now could think of extension of this whole subscription topic.
Yeah.
I think for our time, it's not enough for today.
Yeah, I guess we will have another session for that as well. But I would just call this subscription. We won't look at this for now. Same as, for example, the validation.
I think with this whole validation parts, there are so many unknowns. Maybe we don't need to consider it today.
Okay, so now we have like these 4 things. I mean, we won't consider these. I will just delete these ugly things. We can just keep that in mind that they will produce those. And so we see actually that we have a creation context and we have a publication context with some validation and some subscription. Did we miss something for now?
I think for the start, it looks good. The MVP of the system could actually already work with this one, but I guess as usually we will need to recheck it again and again.
Yes, I guess too. I mean, as a start, it's great. I mean, the first thing we need to do now is probably sleep over it, come back to it, rethink everything, and probably we will change everything. Or our brain will have come up with new ideas and things we have forgotten, and then we can add this here. Great. So now we can actually take off our hats again and fix our hair and go back to our little slideshow. So, of course, this is a completely fabricated example, but we hope that we could like show you how such a session could look like and what the elements are of event storming. And of course, there probably are things that can be done differently. I mean, we have looked at various different ways of doing it, and there are always some slight variations. And also, if you look at Alberto Brandolini's book, there are also some quite good examples. So feel free to share your experiences also with that in the chat, for example. Okay, so that was basically it. Let's now go and have just a small look how we could then take this event storming result and put it into something of a clean architecture. Those who already have done clean architecture know that there's something Uncle Bob calls the screaming architecture. So I think this is one of the things that actually helps us quite a lot to represent what people have said in the code. So first of all, we have different like bounded context, we could call it, like the creation or the publication. And if you start and your system is as unknown for now as like we had it in our example here, you would probably not go and say, well, these are the bounded contexts and I will map them now right onto our microservices. Because what if you find out, well, actually, while implementing, well, we should actually merge the stuff. So then it's probably better to already have it in only one, let's call that macro service. And then you can move around stuff much more easily than if they're already split. I mean, then you would have to merge those things again, and that's much harder than having them all already together. So in the beginning, probably stuff should grow inside one service, and only when you notice, okay, these concepts, they are actually really separate things, then you can start also to separate the services. But as you see here, that's the cool thing about clean architecture. It usually looks always the same. So the focus is very much on the domain. So we have the application and use cases layer, which maps basically to application services as described in the early versions of Eric Evans' books. But they're much more focused. And we can actually benefit from that they're more focused on the use case, because now we can create dancing event use case, and this maps directly from the event storming session. And of course, then we also have our domain with our values, our entities, maybe also our aggregates. And this is also something that directly comes from the domain-driven design book, and you can map it onto your architecture. And it's just cool when everybody is using when everybody is using clean architecture, and you move, for example, from project to project. Well, basically always looks the same, and you find your way very quickly in it. This is a way how you could represent it, but of course there are other slight variations. And when we also look at the use cases testing, I mean, the use case is so focused that you can actually read the tests also as a business representative, and you will probably understand it already from a use case perspective. So if I have, for example, create dancing event use case should, and the first test is create a dancing event, you understand this. But the second thing would then also be the additional information that we only want to have 5 unpublished dancing events. So you could actually say limit the number of unpublished dancing events to 5 at a time. And you can test this, and at the same time you read it. And this is probably not that easy to read, but this would actually be kind of an implementation of such a use case. So the clean architecture use case would actually be the port up there, which says create dancing event, and then this class would actually implement the use case. And typically what we like to do is to have only one method per interface. So every port is basically a verb, something that can be done. It's an action. So create dancing event is the use case, but we have other ports. For example, the two ports up there, the update unpublished dancing events and the fetch publish unpublished dancing events. Most people will probably combine that into some kind of unpublished dancing events repository. And of course, you can do that. But we sometimes just like the interface segregation, because then we can more easily, for example, make own mocks. And also it's much more readable if you look, for example, in the code. We can now write something like the first line of unpublished dancing events equals fetch unpublished dancing events of event organizer. So it basically reads like good code. Of course, this is a baby example, but we can adopt this kind of way of thinking, that we actually think in terms of what do we want and in statements, and take that to also much more complex domains. So we would first fetch the unpublished dancing events, create a new dancing event, and then add the dancing event to the unpublished dancing events. And of course, then we would update the unpublished dancing events. This would be something of a gateway, an outbound port, probably some kind of database, could be a surrounding system, whatever, I don't care. On this level, it's very domain, more or less domain specific. I don't want to actually know that it is persisted. And then create some kind of output, which then would get presented. So here we also have these 2% create dancing event success and failure. And this is probably more of a style choice. I mean, you could have one presenter interface. You could actually inject it probably in the constructor. The problem there is always that when you inject it into the constructor and you only have the create dancing event use case port, you actually don't know where the data is going. So what happens? I mean, you can have a return value, of course, but then you would have to have the presenter somewhere outside. So the only way to tell the user of the inbound port how to actually use it and what kind of presentation that can happen is to pass it as a parameter. And yes, this is very simplified, of course, but this is how you could represent this in the use case. And of course, a little bit of business logic can then be represented in this unpublished dancing events. Let's call it more or less an aggregate. So we say we add a dancing event, but if the number of unpublished dancing events is exceeded, then we just throw some exception. Of course, you can do anything. You can return some value, but this is how we solved it here. And still, it's very readable. I mean, you can take it and go to your business representative and ask, is this how it should work? And then they can verify it, even if they don't speak Java or C# or whatever language it is. It just makes everything more readable if we do this kind of domain modeling and if we add the clean architecture on top. So we're actually already at the end of this little talk. So the last words are to get this to a close. Developing complex software is hard. And the problem is that all stakeholders have probably a different way of looking at the business, at the software, at anything. And software engineers, did you click? Okay, and software engineers typically think in different terms than the business people. So as it turns out, probably we don't know really because there are not so many so many papers about it. But focusing on the domain, which means the real world, and also putting that into the code seems to be one of the more productive ways to develop software, because the mental mapping between the outside world and the internals of the code, they're limited. And as we hopefully could have shown here, is that when you use something like event storming, which I would call is more of a strategic domain-driven design tool, or a more recent one. I mean, the book is not even yet finished. He's still writing it. It's out there already. But something that we can actually use better than just talking to each other to explore some kind of problem domain. And we can use it for defining context, for defining a ubiquitous language, because we talk to each other. We actually talk, we clarify what did you mean, stuff like that. It just happens automatically if you do it with this event storming. And in the end, I mean, if you have already established silos in your company and you bring everybody together, well, you can basically break those silos, because then you see where are the problems that need to be solved. And with this little mapping to clean architecture, I would call this something like a tactical tool of DDD, which can be actually used, is not technically part of DDD, but it's going to be mentioned in lots of books recently, because it maps so perfectly well to the DDD tactical patterns. What it does is focus the separation of concerns from the outside world to different parts. So on the one hand, we have the domain and the use cases, but also on the other hand, we don't forget about the other people, like, for example, the ones that have surrounding systems, or the ones that have UX and presentation. So this also further minimizes the mental mapping for everyone. We're not only domain-driven design, the business domain is the only thing we care about, but also the other important part. So in the end, everybody is represented.
In the end, we want to show you again a bit of colors, because our goal of this session and the goal of what we want to achieve and the teams we are working in is to make everyone happy and productive. And this we can achieve with a shared mental model.
That's it. There are lots of sources, of course. And for example, for domain-driven design, you probably know all the books there are. There are actually new ones. And especially if you want to get an initial overview of what there is, Learning Domain-Driven Design by Vlad Chrononov is really a good overview. I like it much more than, for example, Domain-Driven Design Distilled, or the short version of Evan's book. And if you don't want to get killed by this one, the big red one, or the big blue one that you can see behind there, this one is a great start if you want to get into DDD. So,
such a great and informative session. Thank you very much for both of you. We all enjoyed it. Personally, I especially like the fact that you put emphasis on customer collaboration, right? I mean, even if we open the Agile Manifesto right now, we can see the third sentence. It's about customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And I think that's where DDD, domain-driven design, shines, that it really puts emphasis on setting up this shared mental model, a ubiquitous language, which is understood by both the stakeholders, the domain experts, and the developers, and they can drive the design. So I really like this point.
Yeah, and I would also like to add here the part which I found quite insightful is many DDD meetups go straight into code or something like that, but don't illustrate the thinking process that goes before that. But that's actually the challenging part. How do you identify the bounded context, the events, the entities and stuff like that. So I found that quite useful in this session.
Cool. Well, that's the issue. If you go over it over and over again, and you have like this kind of topic and you want to distill it into what is important and make one coherent red line through it, then probably at some point you miss some things. So I hope there are some questions also that we can discuss about that.
Definitely, we have plenty of questions and topics. We had great discussions in the chat. So let's get started with going through them. So the first one, it was a discussion about dynamic model. It was one from Wolfgang Klinger. He said, an dynamic domain model is also a sign of missing domain focus. And after that, we get another one from Wilcam. An dynamic model only makes sense in poor functional programming, algebraic.
That's what I would have said too. I mean, anemic model is such a term. Yes, it's a code smell, it's a data class, but if you do functional programming, if you have JSONs that you want as details, well, then it's not a problem. But if you use it for domain modeling, well, you need to have functional data, functional code base to justify why you are using it. So yeah, I would have said the same. Oh, Valentina, I don't hear.
We lost you, I guess.
Sorry, I want to say there were also some follow-up comments regarding this one. Maybe Daniel, you could show those ones as well, which were also about anemic domain model.
Absolutely. I was disconnected. Sorry for everyone for a half a minute. I'm back. So yeah, exactly. The next one is this one. Dynamic model means you are creating a CRUD app with no business logic and infrastructure. And there is another good one which can maybe raise a question. The irony is that most of the apps start that way, and then they get more and more complex. So what is your experience? What are your folks' experience about this? I mean, do you always, let's say there is a CRUD application you need to write, then do you always start without aggregate models, all these things, or you start with aggregate models, or what is your take on this?
Maybe I could take over this one. Actually, with CRUD applications, this is what I keep repeating normally. If we only have a CRUD application for now, we probably, and really don't have business behind it, we probably don't need all of the things we learn all together, like DDD. This is way too big for a CRUD application. But if we need to concentrate on the business side, this is a great tool.
It's a good topic, and what I've noticed is nearly every application starts off with as a simple CRUD application. I've never seen an application start as a non-CRUD complex application. And this is where I see different set of arguments. So some people might say it's not worthwhile to invest in clean architecture or anything. It's an overkill for these kind of applications. But then the other argument is it's quite likely that the application will grow in complexity, especially business applications. So we can do it upfront. From my side, during the past years, I'm doing it upfront. So putting in clean architecture and all of these upfront. So even though the domain model might have then the same essentially data structure as the persistence model, I do it that way. And then when developers ask, oh wait, but this looks like duplication. Well, yes, currently it does whilst it's in its CRUD phase, but later it evolves separately.
I always do a preparation, let's call it, for clean architecture. So in case this application will grow or business side of this application will grow, when I still have an easy possibility to introduce it, but I don't introduce use cases if there are no use cases, for example.
So what we do is we introduce a foundation of the application we can build on in the future.
Yes, exactly.
That's another good point for example, use cases. I mean, initially, someone may not have use case handlers, but may have application services, which is much less code compared to having use cases. Yeah. Sorry, Oliver.
No, I just think this use case is basically what you should focus on. I mean, it doesn't really matter what's behind the interface. I mean, you can just, if you're good at refactoring, and I did that too, you can have basically a procedural code behind this use case, and then especially when you think like, well, I'm not sure yet where to put stuff, you don't want to start too early with refactoring, or else you get into other problems. And then you can basically start while the software is evolving, also your domain evolves. So basically everything that is behind the use case interface or the implementation of it can then evolve gradually. And with more knowledge, you may also discover more domain concepts. I mean, this is also something from this event storming session. Don't take it at face value and try to map it directly into the code. I mean, it will evolve. When you implement it, you will find out stuff, and then you go back to the domain expert and talk to them. Does that make more sense to put it there? It's this constant back and forth between domain expert and what's that? Well, it's agile development, basically.
That's a really good point. And the focus that you mentioned regarding use cases, because when we focus on use cases, we're focusing on what the system needs to do, and later the domain can evolve. So at the start, most likely we'll be starting with an anemic domain model, because at the beginning the requirements could be too simple. There might not even be behavior. The initial requirements might be just create, edit, and nothing much more. So it's quite often going to be an anemic domain model, but then later we can refactor it, assuming that we have unit tests targeting use case. Then we're free to refactor the main model.
Mm-hmm. And also this anemic domain model, I guess, is still better than having primitives everywhere. If you have all your domain concepts represented as strings and ints and stuff, it's much harder to get the classes or types again back into the code than to well have an anemic, and then at some point maybe you get data, maybe you get additional behavior, or maybe not. I mean, you don't know yet, but this is some. I mean, the extreme agile people would probably argue like, well, you ain't gonna need it. Don't put anything in that you don't need. Well, okay, but let's shift it a little bit to, we don't need a big upfront design, but maybe a bit of design. Some design is probably good. And I think this anemic model, having some data classes in without actual functionality yet, is something that we actually should always do. And as you said, you put in the clean architecture from the start. Yeah, well, you don't do everything, but at least the structure that you know, well, yes. It's how it is actually defined. And this is also, again, great for everybody that actually knows clean architecture already, because when they start on your project, they're like, oh yeah, here are the ports, here presentation, stuff like that.
Exactly. So I start off with the use cases, the domain model, and anemic domain model, so that the structure is consistent there. I find that less painful compared to later having to completely change the architecture later. So I find it easier to do it sooner. And as you mentioned, the benefits of even an anemic domain model for primitives, so it helps you at least encapsulate or join together data that belongs together. The other also benefit is here that we would then be using constructors, so it would not be just public like getters and setters everywhere, but possibility of constructors, possibility of even basic validation regarding something, not null, or other such validation, which already, how should I say, supports invariance.
Yeah, true. I think this is usually the first thing you put on value objects, like the validation. If you have an email address or so, you could put a regex in that will validate it and keep you from creating invalid. I mean, this is value objects are one of the greatest things there are, actually.
Very good. Thank you very much for all the answers. Let's jump to the next one. In the meantime, we also received other questions, so we have a lot of things to talk about. Let's see. Yeah, here I think the next one is a compliment to Alina. Alina is such a patient subject matter expert. People I deal with generally want to jump out of the meeting at this level of technical detail. Maybe what is your experience about this, about talking about too much technical details with these subject matter experts? What is your experience on this?
I think it's important in the beginning to explain why, for example, a product owner should stay until the end in this session. Yeah, and maybe, I don't know, actually, we tried it out with a session with our very complicated domain at work, and I realized it's quite difficult to explain how it works and how the domain works in the same time. So we had some misunderstandings, like, let's say, also about business people in the call. But I don't know, I think if people know how it works, and for example business people know the domain, we are still quite patient about staying in the session and share their knowledge until the end, because we know what is the result of this session. But if people don't know what is the result of the session, maybe they might get impatient if they start to talk like weird tech stuff.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Next to that, they should be also open to these sessions, right? It's also a foundation of communication, right? Or efficient communication, that they need to be open. And also leads to a comment from Hussein that soft skills are also important too. And
probably more important than the hard skills.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was thinking lately, that there is nothing soft in soft skills, right? I mean, picking up soft skills can, it's way more difficult than picking up any tech skills, right? I mean, learning a tech skills can take, for example, a meeting or a training, right? 1 2 weeks long training. But picking up really soft skills requires long lasting and repeated effort. So hard skills are soft skills are hard, actually, in my opinion.
Especially for us software engineers.
Exactly.
We need to learn that from the ground.
Exactly.
And ultimately, the other point to also add is that ultimately we need both. So one hand, we need the soft skills in order to be able to establish good relationships with business, and to help them stay in the session, and to help them retain attention, and to formulate the discussion in a way that's more understandable to them, without introducing technical stuff, for example, without accidentally introducing the database in the discussion, which is what developers might do. So that's one part. But on the other hand, the technical skill set is when we have to translate that domain model into programming. On one hand, training does help with initial foundations of concepts, but later to also become a technical expert, it does take years of experience, hands-on coaching, mentoring, etc. So both of them ultimately are needed.
Yeah, I think as a software engineer, it's like you need to know this and everything there, and it's like and by the way, the domain you need to understand too, and I mean, our brains explode if we want to be really good. I mean, it's a young people's game, actually. If you look around, I mean, we are everybody is young. There are really few people that are above 50 that are still software engineering and not in middle management somewhere. So this is actually, I mean, how should we have the experience to actually do real good software development? I mean, that covers all these things, and I think this is quite a problem we have still. And I don't know how long it will take until this finally a bit better, but we'll see.
Yes, that's a good point. How to enable really technically strong people to progress further in the technical sense, or later maybe to become mentors or coaches, as opposed to progressing into straight management, and then the company is losing the skill set, the technical skill set of those people.
Very good. Let's jump to the next question. It's a short one. Will this Miro board be shared later?
Well, could be. I don't know. Can it be? Probably I cannot share it with the whole world.
No, I think you can share.
It could be. Yeah, we can check the settings.
Okay, we will do our best, and if so, maybe we can extract PDF or something like that, and we can at the description of this YouTube video we will place it if it's possible. Okay, here we have another compliment and a question. Awesome. Sorry, from Susan. Awesome. So very clear and practical. Could you provide a list of questions a facilitator can use if there is a lot of silence in the room?
A lot of silence in the room. Usually you need to be really in that, because the people are ripping their throats out each other's. But like there's a real silence in the room.
No, but I think it might happen. And when you have events, one event is here and another event is somewhere and you know it already as a dev, for example. And then you could see, okay, which events could lead from this event to this event, or what would happen in between. With this kind of question, you probably could feel the silence.
Yes, and maybe it could be an indicator that the business is not able to keep up with the developers' questions, and maybe it's indicating that steps need to be taken back or something needs to be formulated in a simpler way.
Very good. Thank you very much for the answers. The next one will be a bit of technical one. We can debate on it a bit. So from Wolfgang, you folks showed the code example, and Wolfgang said, what's the interface create dancing event good for here? It's implemented only by this one class, I guess, so totally useless. So what do you think about this? Do you agree with this or not, or it is a nitpicking?
And maybe to show, I think we could do a screen share just so that whoever is watching remembers what this was referring to.
Exactly, the code.
So this up here, right?
I think yes, exactly. This is what.
It was actually the last thing I put in. So, well, this, in my opinion, it has a little bit to do with do you want to really do it? I mean, do you want to do the clean architecture style, which is based on hexagonal architecture, where you think about, well, what is my system, and I actually have the interface and I don't want to know what's behind it, so that here we only have like create dancing event use case. Well, that might be, but if you have something like a really large application service, and you might want to start splitting that up, for example, because you want to do interface segregation. I mean, you want to split that big class you have up. Then it makes sense to have these interfaces or these ports also from a practical point of view. Not only because you say I do clean architecture, that's why I have a use case inbound port. I have my use case and I separate those. But it's just there it actually makes sense, because you as a client don't need to know how it is actually implemented in the end. So you abstract it away, say, well, this is my inbound port. I use this. How you implement it, do however you want. This is my first analysis. Maybe you have others.
Mm-hmm. I would like to add something as well here, since there are actually variants regarding implementation. And my personal observation is that some people are using the approach of having interface and implementation, but other people are using the other approach, which is what Wolfgang is saying here, which is essentially having just the use case itself. I would say that from a perspective of hexagonal architecture, which is telling us that there's essentially user-side input ports and those server-side ports, that then those ports are essentially implemented as interfaces. So that is what's at the boundary of the hexagon, but inside the hexagon is where we have concrete classes. So that's the approach that I lean on towards, based on essentially hexagonal architecture. But if we look at the style that's done by Uncle Bob regarding clean architecture and use cases, he does not apply these the interfaces, but goes straight to the implementation. So I would say on this one that there isn't a hard and fast answer, that both approaches are being used. In my case, what I'm doing is for use cases, I'm using the command dispatch model. So all of my use case handlers are essentially implementing a base request handler interface with a certain request response. So this means that there's actually then free variants to implement this.
I think we really need to be. I mean, this is. It depends again. I mean, if you just see what we implemented there, yeah, probably it would not make sense, especially if you use some dependency injection like Spring, for example. Then you don't need necessarily this interface. On the other hand, if you want to test, for example, what's it called, a controller, so then you probably don't want to have or you may not want to have the whole use case attached to it. So then you could create an own mock based on that interface. And if you already have like not only one use case, but actually a service of use cases, then you would already have to override all these others as well. Or you need to introduce something like Mockito, which is also, I don't like it. I try to do it based on interfaces without additional dependencies. But again, there are ups and downs, pros and cons on how on using or not.
I like that you mentioned that one regarding testing controllers, because if we look at integration testing for controllers or contract testing, to test the REST API layer, like is it correctly returning, success message, failure message, it means we need to, and we don't want to test the whole business logic. So in that case, we'd want to introduce test doubles for the use case input ports, and then having interfaces there is convenient for mocking. The other variant, if we had concrete classes, then depending on the language and framework, it may or may not be able to be mocked.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent points. Let's jump to the next question. It's also, again, a short one relating to the topic, to the details. Namely, will the code presented be available somehow? Just like the middle board?
Sure.
Maybe on GitHub or something like that.
Yeah. We'll put it on GitHub.
We can do that. Very good. The next one is from Marina. Working with already existing applications and or a legacy system, what would be the first steps you would see to start implementing DDD? Or would you see it ready for a new application?
how should I start? I'm I'm working more in the legacy system context, and we really try to introduce a clean architecture. But since the system is so big and with so many primitives and spaghetti code, so it's not that easy to see whole domains. So, or as we cannot see bounded context, and since we want to modularize our software, so we need to find those bounded contexts somehow. That's why we started with eventstorming at our place. So we started to find bounded context in existing system, and this is why I said before it was not that easy, since our domain is so big and so complicated, and we didn't have too many experts in eventstorming, let's call it, in our team. So I think we will separate next time. We will work more on eventstorming first, so we understand how to use this practice, and then we will invite domain experts. And on the domain experts, I mean not only PO, but I also mean sales and other departments who could also give us some information about this complicated domain. And then we will introduce this session. And our hope is that we will find bounded contexts in our system, and then we can modularize.
This is a good topic. Here I'd like to also share my experiences too. I found it too hard to simply jump to domain-driven design in first step for legacy applications. And in fact, that was one of the last things that I would do in a legacy application transformation. The very first thing that I would do is no bounded context either, just taking a monolith, so it's essentially one huge big bounded context, and just do the separation as required by hexagonal architecture, so that we separate the domain away from infrastructure and presentation. So introducing that as essentially a first step action item. Then when we have that, we would generally have FIC application services, which then I would proceed to splitting into use case handlers, which is also a relatively mechanical task. So this does not mean truly understanding the use cases. It means look at the application service, the public methods, and use that as the approximation for what are going to be the use case handlers. As for the domain model, there currently is no true domain model. So instead, I would take the ORM model which exists, placing it, it would be placed in some domain folder, even though this obviously violates, principles regarding separation of infrastructure models and domain, but look, it's good enough for now. And so essentially the use case handlers, they are referencing the ORM models, which have just plain getters and setters, and writing tests which are targeting the use case handlers. Then when we have that stability and protection by the tests, which takes itself a long time to cover the code base, then I would proceed to extracting out the domain model, which would be looking at what's the code base in the use case handler and which part of the use case handler code base only requires the fields that are in the entity. And that to me is a signal, okay, I could move those validation, those behaviors into the domain entity. So it's sort of doing a like cut and paste, almost as a mechanical activity. And this was the approach that I had used in cases where there was no documentation, there were no domain experts, there was no event storming, but rather from the code itself, just through logical extraction to move it. And in fact, that was like helpful to get that foundation at first. So that's another approach that could also be considered.
But I think this approach doesn't always work. So, for example, if you have code which you really cannot separate, you really don't know what this code does, and you don't know the domain behind it, it's very difficult to start from the code. So in this case, I would start from the domain.
Well, ideally, it would be great to have a domain expert so that someone doesn't do just mechanically from the code, but it is a worst case scenario. If there's no domain expert, then have to do it directly from the code, but it would reduce time and make it easier if there was a domain expert so that you could, yes, get both their insights and look at the code itself.
Unfortunately, we reached the end of the session. It's 7 o'clock. It's time to. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yes. We can hear you.
Sorry.
Again.
It's a connection problem. Yeah. Sorry. So it's time to wrap it up. Yeah, I'm here. So thank you very much for this session. We all learned a lot. So thanks a lot for Alina and Oliver, and especially to Valentina, audience. We all had a great time. And I wish you all an amazing evening further, and see you next time.
Yes, I really enjoyed the presentation today, and since we did have a lot of other open questions in the chat, I would say, if possible, during subsequent days, if Oliver and Alina have any chance to go through the chat and maybe respond here as comments on YouTube, since there were so many questions today. Thanks a lot, everyone. I really found this session useful.
Thank you too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.